The transport truck smelled of sweat, blood, and defeat. Werner Brandt pressed his back against the wooden slats and counted the breaths of 36 other men crammed into darkness. They had traveled for 3 days across occupied France, crossed the channel in a ship that groaned like a dying animal, and now rolled through countryside that looked nothing like the propaganda posters had promised. England was supposed to be burning. Instead, it was green and wet and impossibly alive. The truck stopped. Canvas ripped open. Gray English light flooded in like cold water. A British sergeant shouted words Werner barely understood, but the meaning was clear enough. "Get out! Line up! Move!" Camp 23 sat in the flatlands of Lincolnshire, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers that seemed almost embarrassed by their own existence. By late 1943, Britain held over 200,000 German prisoners, and the camps had become small cities of the defeated. Werner had heard rumors during the journey. Some men said the British starved their prisoners. Others claimed they worked them to death in coal mines. A corporal from Bavaria swore the food was poisoned with something that made you forget your own name. Werner did not believe the rumors. He believed in what he could see, smell, and taste. And right now, he could see a camp commandant standing at the gate with the tired eyes of a man who had stopped counting days long ago. Major Harold Whitmore was 53 years old and had buried his only son somewhere in the sand of Dunkirk. He looked at the new arrivals the way a farmer looks at livestock delivered in poor condition. Not with hatred, with calculation. How many would survive the winter? How many would cause trouble? How many would simply fade into the gray routine of captivity until the war decided their fate? Werner caught the major's gaze for half a second. Neither man blinked. Then Werner was pushed forward into the processing line, and the moment dissolved like breath in cold air. The barracks smelled of damp wool and unwashed men. Werner found a bunk near the window, where a crack in the frame let in a thin whistle of wind. The man beside him was young, perhaps 19, with the hollow cheeks of someone who had stopped eating before capture. His name was Johann Vogel, and he still believed Germany would win the war. "They cannot keep us here forever," Johann whispered that first night. "The Führer will negotiate our release. We are soldiers, not criminals." Werner said nothing. He had stopped believing in negotiations after Stalingrad, after his younger brother Conrad vanished into the Russian snow and never sent another letter, after the bakery his family had run for 3 generations became rubble under British bombs. Belief was a luxury for men who still had something to lose. The first meal came at 6 in the evening. Boiled cabbage, a thin stew with meat that might have been beef or might have been boot leather. Bread, so hard it could crack teeth. Werner watched the British guards eating at their own table and noticed something that made his stomach turn in a different way. They were eating the same thing. This was not punishment. This was rationing. Britain had been at war for 4 years. German U-boats had strangled their supply lines. The entire island was surviving on what little could be grown, caught, or borrowed from American ships dodging torpedoes in the Atlantic. The gray food was not cruelty. It was equality in suffering, but not everyone understood this. Sergeant Klaus Richter had survived the Eastern Front, and survival had made him sharp in ways that cut everyone around him. He gathered men in the corner of the barracks and spoke in low, urgent tones about slow poison, about British doctors experimenting on prisoners, about chemicals in the water that would make them docile and weak. Half the men believed him because fear was easier than uncertainty. Johann stopped eating entirely. He pushed away his plate and stared at the wall with the determination of a man building his own coffin. Werner tried to reason with him, but Johann's eyes had the glassy shine of someone who had already decided that resistance meant refusal. On the 4th night, Werner found Johann collapsed on the floor, too weak to reach his bunk. He carried the boy to his bed and pressed a piece of bread against his cracked lips. "Eat," he whispered. "Starving yourself does not hurt them. It only hurts you." Johann shook his head. Werner forced the bread into his mouth anyway. Across the barracks, Klaus watched with eyes like broken glass. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any accusation. The next morning, Werner noticed something strange. A British guard named Eddie Marsh, barely older than Johann, was slipping extra bread to an elderly German prisoner who could no longer stand in the food line. Their hands touched for a moment. The old man whispered something in broken English. Eddie nodded and moved on. Werner and Eddie's eyes met through the morning fog. No words passed between them. No gestures. Just recognition of something neither could name. In a camp built on the architecture of enemies, two men had seen each other as something else. Something human. Winter was coming. The food would get worse. The paranoia would get louder. But somewhere in the gray machinery of war, a crack had appeared. And cracks, Werner knew from years of baking, were where the light got in. Snow came to Lincolnshire in December like a punishment from a god who had forgotten which side deserved mercy. The camp transformed into a frozen maze of white drifts and black ice. Pipes burst. The coal supply dwindled to ration handfuls. Men who had survived bullets and bombs now feared something far simpler. The cold. Werner woke one morning to find the camp cook had collapsed in the kitchen. Pneumonia, the medic said. Maybe typhus. Either way, the man who fed 400 prisoners and 50 guards would not be standing over a stove anytime soon. The kitchen fell into chaos. Meals became random. Portions became guesses. And Major Whitmore faced a problem that had no military solution, that he needed someone who could cook. Someone who could stretch nothing into something. Someone who understood that feeding men was not about ingredients, but about will. Klaus Richter volunteered Werner before Werner could speak. It was not kindness. Klaus wanted the baker gone from the barracks. Away from the men he was slowly poisoning with hope. Let the British have him. Let him become a collaborator in everyone's eyes. Klaus would handle the rest. Werner walked into the camp kitchen on a Thursday morning and found himself face to face with Mrs. Margaret Finch. She was 51 years old, built like a woman who had spent her life lifting iron pots and heavier sorrows. Her husband had been a merchant sailor. His ship went down in the North Atlantic in 1941, torpedoed by a German U-boat. She had received a telegram and a pension. Nothing else. She did not speak to Werner. Not a single word. She communicated through slammed cabinet doors, through pointed gestures, through a silence so thick it had weight. Werner understood. He was the enemy wearing an apron. He was the face of every submarine captain who had ever aimed at a cargo ship full of flour and hope. But Werner also understood something else. The kitchen was failing. The rationing system that kept Britain alive depended on precision, on making every gram count. Mrs. Finch was a good cook, but she had never learned to cook with almost nothing. Werner had. 3 years of war had taught him to make bread from sawdust and water, soup from bones picked clean twice, meals that filled stomachs without filling plates that he began without permission. He reorganized the pantry. He calculated portions down to the ounce. He showed the young British assistants how to knead dough with less flour, how to season with herbs grown wild behind the latrines, how to roast vegetable scraps into something that tasted almost like satisfaction. Mrs. Finch watched from the corner of her eye. She said nothing, but she stopped slamming doors. The first week passed in cold silence. The second week, Werner found a small bag of real sugar on his workstation. No note, no explanation, just sugar, worth more than gold in wartime Britain. He looked at Mrs. Finch. She was stirring a pot and did not look back, but her shoulders had softened. The ice was cracking. Back in the barracks, the ice was turned to fire. Klaus had spread his story well. Werner the collaborator. Werner the traitor. Werner who cooked British food with German hands and had forgotten which uniform he once wore. The men avoided him. Conversations stopped when he entered. His bunk had been moved to the corner, near the drafty crack in the wall. Johann suffered worst of all, because he had defended Werner, because he had eaten the bread Werner forced into his mouth that night. Klaus called him Werner's spy, Werner's pet, Werner's little dog. One evening, Werner returned from the kitchen to find Johann on the floor, bleeding from his lip, surrounded by men who had once been his comrades. Werner helped him to his feet. Johann's eyes were empty. Not angry, not sad, just empty, like windows in a bombed building. Why do you keep trying? Johann whispered. They hate us both now. Werner cleaned the blood from Johann's face with a rag that smelled like onions and coal smoke. Because hate is heavy, he said, and I'm too tired to carry it anymore. The next morning, Major Whitmore summoned Werner to his office. On the desk lay stacks of paperwork and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The major looked like he had not slept in days. More prisoners were coming, he explained. Wounded men from the Eastern Front. Men missing limbs, missing minds, missing everything except the breath in their lungs. The camp needed to expand food production. They needed Werner to train British cooks. Not as enemies, as colleagues. Werner understood what this meant. He would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. He would become, in the eyes of men like Klaus, everything they feared. But he also understood what hunger looked like when it wore a uniform. He had seen it in Johann's hollow cheeks. He had seen it in his own reflection. He accepted. That night, he returned to the barracks and spoke to the men who would still listen. Friday, he said, his voice steady despite the cold stares. Something different is coming. I cannot explain it yet. But wait. Just wait. Klaus laughed from his corner. But Johann looked up with something new in his eyes. Something that might have been curiosity, or might have been the first fragile seed of trust. The smell arrived before the food. It drifted through the camp like a rumor too good to believe, curling through barracks and around watchtowers, reaching men who had forgotten that food could be anything other than survival. Hot oil, crispy batter, something golden rising from gray kitchens into gray air. Friday, March 1944. A date that would mean nothing in history books, but everything to the 400 men who shuffled toward the mess hall with suspicion in their eyes and hunger in their bellies. Werner stood at the serving line beside Eddie Marsh, both of them sweating despite the cold, both of them carrying trays loaded with fish and chips wrapped in newspaper. Real fish, caught off the Lincolnshire coast by fishermen who owed favors to Mrs. Finch's cousin. Real potatoes, traded from a farm whose owner remembered when German prisoners had helped save his harvest from early frost. Real batter, made from Werner's grandmother's recipe, adapted with English malt vinegar because that was all they had. Fish and chips had survived the war when almost nothing else did. The British government had refused to ration them, understanding that some things held a nation together better than speeches or propaganda. Every Friday, across bombed cities and blacked-out villages, families gathered around newspaper bundles and remembered what normal used to taste like. Now that memory was being offered to men who had been taught to hate everything British. The prisoners lined up slowly. Some refused to look at the food. Others stared like children seeing snow for the first time. Klaus stood at the back of the line with his arms crossed, making sure everyone saw his contempt. He would not eat. He would not give them the satisfaction. Johann could barely walk. Months of refusing food had hollowed him into a ghost of the boy who had once believed in victory. Werner left his station and carried a plate to where Johann sat alone in the corner. The young man looked at the golden fish, at the chips glistening with salt, at the steam rising like a small prayer. I cannot, Johann whispered. You can, Werner said. This is not their food or our food. This is just food. Eat. Johann's hand trembled as he lifted a chip to his mouth. The crunch broke something inside him. Not his will. Something harder. The wall he had built between himself and everything that might make captivity bearable. His eyes closed. His jaw moved. And for one moment, he was not a prisoner. He was not a soldier. He was not a number on a British manifest. He was just a hungry boy tasting something warm and good. The mess hall transformed. Conversations that had been forbidden began in whispers, then grew louder. A German sergeant who had fought at El Alamein found himself sitting across from a British corporal who had been there too, on the other side of the same sand. They did not speak the same language, but they understood the same exhaustion, the same relief that both of them were still breathing. Eddie Marsh sat down across from Werner. He pulled out a small pencil and a scrap of paper, drew a crude fish, then drew himself, trying to catch it, falling into the water, the fish swimming away. Werner laughed. The first real laugh in months. Eddie grinned and drew another fish, this one biting Eddie's finger. Werner laughed harder. Around them, the impossible was happening. Guards and prisoners sharing tables. Men who had shot at each other's countrymen now passing salt and vinegar between hands that had once held rifles. The war had not stopped. The barbed wire still surrounded them. The watchtowers still watched. But inside the mess hall, for 1 hour, None of that existed. Klaus could not stand it. He found Werner outside after the meal, where the cold air turned breath into fog and words into weapons. His face was twisted with something beyond anger. Betrayal. Fear. The terror of a man watching his certainties dissolve. "You're making them forget," Klaus hissed. "Forget that we are soldiers. Forget that we are at war. Forget that these people bombed our cities, killed our families, destroyed everything we loved." Werner did not step back. "I'm not making them forget. I am reminding them." Of what? That hunger does not wear a uniform. That a meal shared is not a surrender. That we can survive this war without losing what makes us worth surviving for. Klaus raised his fist. For a moment, Werner thought he would strike. But Johann appeared beside them, still pale, still thin, but standing straighter than he had in months. He looked at Klaus with eyes that had seen too much for 19 years. "My father served under you," Johann said quietly. "Before Stalingrad. Before they executed him for saying we could not win. You called him a coward. But look at us now, Sergeant. Look where courage brought us. To a cage. To gray food and gray days and gray futures. Maybe my father was not the coward. Maybe he was just the first to see the truth." Klaus stared at the boy. His fist dropped. He turned and walked into the darkness without another word. Werner put a hand on Johann's shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Behind them, through the mess hall windows, light spilled out onto the frozen ground. And somewhere inside, a British guard was teaching a German prisoner how to properly apply vinegar to chips. Major Whitmore watched from his office. Mrs. Finch stood beside him, her arms crossed, her eyes suspiciously bright. Neither spoke. The major picked up his pen and wrote in his journal words he would never share with his superiors. Today, for 1 hour, there was no war in Camp 23. Only men eating together. I do not know if this is victory or defeat. Perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps it is what we have been fighting for all along, without knowing how to name it. The war ended on a Tuesday. Werner heard the news while kneading dough in the camp kitchen, his hands white with flour, his mind somewhere between Hamburg and a future he could not imagine. Germany had surrendered. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed after 12. Millions were dead. Cities were rubble. And 400 men in a Lincolnshire camp suddenly had to decide what living meant when the war that had defined them was over. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in silence, so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. Klaus walked to the fence and stood there for hours, staring at the English countryside like a man searching for something he had lost and would never find. The certainties that had carried him through the Eastern Front, through capture, through the bitter winters of captivity, had evaporated like morning frost. He was not a soldier anymore. He was just a man standing in a foreign country, waiting for someone to tell him what came next. Johann found him there as the sun began to set. The young man had changed over the past year. The hollowness had filled with something harder and quieter, something that had survived starvation and betrayal and the slow death of everything he once believed. He placed a hand on Klaus's shoulder. Klaus did not push him away. "What do we do now?" Klaus asked. It was the first time Johann had ever heard uncertainty in his voice. "We go home," Johann said, "or we find a new one." Repatriation came slowly. The British had over 400,000 German prisoners scattered across camps, farms, and work details. Some had been in England for years. Some had married local women. Some had children who would grow up speaking English with German fathers and British mothers. The neat categories of enemy and ally had blurred into something more complicated, more human, more impossible to sort. Werner was offered a choice. He could return to Hamburg, where his family's bakery had been reduced to a crater surrounded by haunted streets. Or he could accept sponsored passage to rebuild elsewhere. Britain was offering work permits to prisoners with useful skills. Bakers were useful. Men who could make something from nothing were essential in a world where nothing was all most people had misses. Finch made the decision easier. She found Werner in the kitchen on his last official day and handed him a letter. Inside was an address in Manchester, a recommendation written in her careful handwriting, and a sum of money she had saved from her widow's pension. You taught me that bread does not care who bakes it, she said. It rises for anyone with patient hands. England needs patient hands right now. Stay. Build something. Werner looked at the woman who had not spoken to him for the first month of their acquaintance. The woman who had lost her husband to a German torpedo. The woman who had watched him work in her kitchen and slowly, grudgingly, impossibly, come to trust him. Why? He asked. She did not answer directly. Instead, she turned to the window where spring rain was washing the last of winter from the camp. My husband would have hated you, she said quietly. He was a stubborn man, held grudges like other men hold photographs. But I'm not my husband, and I'm tired of hating. It takes too much energy. I would rather bake. Werner accepted. The night before he left Camp 23, he found Klaus in the empty barracks. The bunks had been stripped. The walls seemed thinner without men leaning against them. 2 years of shared captivity hung in the air like dust. I hated you, Klaus said without looking up, for making this bearable, for making me forget why I was supposed to hate them. Werner sat on the bunk across from him. And now, Klaus finally met his eyes. The hardness was still there, but something else lived behind it. Exhaustion, acceptance, the beginning of something that might one day become peace. Now I do not know what I feel, Klaus admitted, but I shook Eddie Marsh's hand this morning. He gave me his address, told me I could write to him. An Englishman, asking a German soldier to be his pen friend. The world has gone mad, Brandt. Completely mad. Werner Schmiedet. Perhaps it was always mad. Perhaps we are only now seeing it clearly. They shook hands. The first time in 2 years, Eddie caught Werner at the camp gate the next morning, breathless from running. He pressed a photograph into Werner's palm. A small pub in a Yorkshire village, with Eddie's family standing in front. An address was scrawled on the back. Best fish and chips in England, Eddie said. Real ones, not camp ones. You come visit. You promised me. Werner promised that in 1962, a small bakery opened in Manchester. The sign above the door read, Brandt's Bread and Friday Fish. The specialty was fish and chips made with Werner's grandmother's batter recipe, adapted with English malt vinegar. A photograph hung on the wall beside the counter. 3 people standing together in front of the shop on opening day. Werner, gray-haired now, but still strong. Eddie Marsh, wearing a suit that did not quite fit. Mrs. Margaret Finch, smiling for perhaps the first time in 20 years. Underneath the photograph, a handwritten note in Werner's careful script. Hunger has no flag. Every year on the anniversary of that first fish and chips Friday, a package arrived at a small school in Munich. Inside was a photograph, a recipe card, and a letter from Werner to Johann, who had become a teacher of history, who taught his students about the war not as victory or defeat, but as a lesson in what men could become when they forgot to hate. The letter always ended the same way. Remember the day we stopped being soldiers and started being men again. Johann kept every letter in a wooden box beside his bed. And every year, on that Friday in March, he made fish and chips for his family using Werner's recipe. His children asked why. His grandchildren asked why. He always gave the same answer. Because some meals are not about food. They are about remembering that even in the darkest times, someone chose kindness. And that choice changed everything.